President Donald Trump authorized Operation Epic Fury with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, a joint US-Israeli strike on the 27th of February 2026. It began that evening and killed Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, within its first hours. Since then, a Hormuz blockade, an occupation of southern Lebanon, two ceasefires, and two collapses. The most recent broke down on the 8th of July. Right now in August 2026, southern Iran is regularly over 50 degrees Celsius. That's hot enough to bring on exertional heat stroke fast. Not the slow onset kind that affects the elderly over days, but the kind that hits fit people carrying heavy loads in a matter of an hour or less, once gear and body armor trap heat against the skin. And standard issue US combat uniforms don't have built-in cooling. That's not a fielded capability for regular ground troops. Combine the two, soldiers carrying heavy equipment in that heat, with nothing cooling what they're wearing, it would be very easy for Iran to strike heat-stroked American troops, cut the supply lines of a modern, fuel-hungry, ammunition-hungry military that can't function without it. For reference, during Operation Iraqi Freedom, the American invasion of Iraq began on the 20th of March 2003, when Iraq's climate was around 25 to 28 degrees. Palatable enough for fast American shock and awe operations on the flat desert terrain in cool weather. Considering Iran, in the summer at this operational ceiling, large-scale ground operations in that heat is a logistical nightmare before a single shot is fired. What's actually feasible right now is what's actually happening. Air raids on military infrastructure and civilian infrastructure, roads, bridges, and most particularly, desalination plants. The window for anything larger, a special operation on the Iranian coast and the islands near major ports like Bandar Abbas, opens the heat breaks. And that window lines up with a political schedule. The US midterms. This isn't abstract pressure. Congress never authorized this war. No declaration, no AUMF was ever submitted, and Democratic Congressman John Larson has already filed 13 articles of impeachment against Trump and Defense Secretary Hegseth specifically over that War Powers Resolution violation. As November 2026 approaches, a Trump-led Republican House and Senate majority at risk has a narrow, specific incentive to force a decisive moment before voters do it for them. The shape of an autumn escalation, if it comes, would be selective special forces operations and raids rather than an immediate larger ground presence. The kind of numbers usually discussed range from 50 to 100,000 troops, aimed at Iran's coast, not its interior. Kharg Island, the country's main oil export terminal, Bandar Abbas, the Chabahar port in the southeast. The stated intent, seize or destroy, then withdraw, and not occupy. Given American shock and awe doctrine, the Americans intend to win the war as quickly and as cheaply as possible, with the least casualties possible. Shock and awe bases itself on overwhelming firepower to dismantle enemy resistance, but in a war of attrition against a defender using the principles of asymmetric warfare, those tactics quickly become obsolete. Focusing on the potential operation in October and November 2026, the Americans would fund recurring rebellions and use them as bait to get the Iranians out of their fortified mountain bunker installations, then rely on American forces to strike. This strategy, having ethnic proxies flee and attack to force the Iranians deep in the mountains to come out, is designed to draw them into the open, where American forces can strike. Iran's ethnic minorities, the Kurds in the northwest, Ahwazi Arabs in the oil-rich Khuzestan, Baloch groups in the southeast have been pursuing independence and separatist movements for decades. Sunni Muslim ethnic enclaves like Balochistan, wedged between Iran and Pakistan, want independence from Shia-dominated Iran. For many separatists, this looks like a prime moment to finally break free from Iran's grip, with the Americans and Israelis already destabilizing the state. There's a real active Kurdish rebellion underway in Iran right now, and armed factions like the Jaish al-Adl are already operating against Iranian forces. The plan, such as it exists, would arm and fund these groups to move first, like putting bait in the water trying to get a fish to catch it. The Iranians are not fools and understand the strategy well. Retaliation would likely come from drone swarms to disrupt American backed proxies, using the same offensive playbook Ukraine uses against Russia: asymmetric warfare, not a single concentrated blow against a rigid, hubristic adversary relying primarily on conventional methods. That's an effective way to destabilize and disorganize. There's also the question of loyalty to an invading conventional force. Whether the Kurds in Tabriz, Balochis in Sistan and the southeast, and Ahwazi Arabs in Khuzestan actually deliver is a separate question, and the honest answer, based on how these groups have behaved historically, isn't that they'll take the money and run. Though that's plausible too, and probably likely. It's that they have good reason to hesitate. In 1991, during Operation Desert Storm, when the US and roughly 35 other countries invaded Iraq to liberate the US oil colony Kuwait, the US encouraged an Iraqi Kurdish uprising and then didn't back it, and Saddam's retaliation was brutal. Every Kurdish, Baloch, and Ahwazi faction watching this war in 2026 knows that story very well. Thus, potential rational hesitation, not fraud, is the realistic risk. Here's the part that should worry anyone planning this. Iran likely wants American troops on its coast, like a crocodile waiting for a gazelle at the watering hole, only closing in when it's too late to escape. Not because the coast is where US troops are weak, though in this analogy that's the gazelle's position, given the heat, the terrain, and the compounding logistical strain from Iranian strikes. A coastal seizure isn't the most dangerous part, though it would already leave American troops heavily exposed to airstrikes and disrupted logistics. Going inland is the real piece de resistance. When a hubristic force pushes inland to save men or seize a uranium or munitions facility, the most precarious moment is if that force gets drawn in chasing a retreating enemy or trying to rescue troops that get cut off into terrain like the Lut Desert, one of the hottest, most hostile places on Earth, where satellite measured ground surface temperatures have exceeded 70 degrees Celsius, hot enough to cook an egg on the rock itself. There's a version of this trap without Iran's mountains, on the flat, frozen steppe of Russia instead, and it's not a new story. In 1812, Napoleon crossed into Russia with over 600,000 men. After the retreat from Moscow, a little over 100,000 came back. The popular story is that winter killed the Grande Armée. Not really. Most of the losses occurred before the first snowfall. What killed Napoleon's army was distance, an oversized force overrunning its own supply lines into territory that offered nothing back, because the Russians had deliberately burned what they couldn't carry. Swap Russian winter for Iranian desert heat, and the mechanism doesn't change. An overextended force doesn't need to be beaten in battle. It needs to run out of road. If Iran chooses a specific place to make that trap close, there's a sharper, smaller scale precedent: Dien Bien Phu in 1954. Viet Minh forces encircled a French garrison from the high ground surrounding a remote valley, destroyed the airfield, and cut the only resupply route that mattered, the one through the air. 57 days later, the French surrendered. The modern equivalent doesn't need 600,000 men, though it needs one isolated force and one severed supply line. A failed autumn push would hand Iran leverage precisely where it's already shown it wants to apply pressure: the Strait of Hormuz, already blockaded once this year, and the Houthis, who already have been used to pressure Saudi and Red Sea shipping. Desalination infrastructure has already been hit multiple times this year. Trump himself has publicly threatened to target it directly, and Kuwaiti, Emirati, and Bahraini and Iranian plants have all already sustained damage from various sides. Over time, these attacks will likely escalate. This is effectively a zero-sum game. If one side takes an eye, the other side is obligated to do the same. Europe is not waiting to see if it gets pulled in. It already has been. On the 1st of March, a Shahed-type drone hit a hangar at RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus. Minor damage, but a direct strike on NATO-adjacent territory. More drones were intercepted on the 1st and 4th by British and Greek forces directly. Active defense, not geographic luck. The attribution is genuinely disputed, officially attributed to Hezbollah acting as an Iranian proxy, not confirmed direct Iranian strike. But an IRGC general, Sardar Jabari, said the quiet part out loud on the record. Iran would, quote, launch missiles at Cyprus with such intensity that the Americans will be forced to leave. That is dangerous language for a European country on the periphery of the European Union, with a named official stating the goal directly. Europe's response was immediate and real. Greece deployed 2 frigates and 4 F-16s to defend Cyprus. France, Italy, Spain, and the Netherlands and Germany sent naval frigates of their own. Italy sent 160 Marines. The EU discussed invoking Article 42.7, its own mutual defense clause, separate from NATO's Article 5, which notably was never formally invoked. NATO's Secretary General said the alliance would, quote, defend every inch of NATO territory, though practically, here that's fluffy European rhetoric. The actual formal response has been more measured than the rhetoric suggests, and that gap matters for what happens next. Europe's stake here isn't abstract. Roughly 12 to 15% of EU oil and 7 to 8% of its LNG moves through the Strait of Hormuz or from Qatar, a real vulnerability, especially with European gas markets already strained since the loss of Russian supply, though not existential on its own. Most of what moves through Hormuz, up around 90%, is bound for Asia and not Europe. Suda Bay on Crete is the actual center of gravity to watch, the largest US base in the eastern Mediterranean, already reinforced with surge fighter jets specifically over Iran tensions, and already the subject of emergency security measures after Iran threatened it by name. Israel has formalized its own stake in this corner of the map, a quote hexagon of alliances, naming Greece and Cyprus as key partners. A signed trilateral military plan with both countries, and a status of forces agreement letting Israeli forces actually station on Greek soil. Here's what doesn't need speculation. Russia signed a new defense contract with Iran 5 days before this war started. Hundreds of manpads, thousands of missiles. It has supplied Su-35 fighters, Yak-130 trainers, Mi-28 attack helicopters, and armored vehicles, and it has kept producing and delivering aircraft and training Iranian pilots throughout the war. It is providing satellite imagery and intelligence specifically to help Iran target American forces. And it's reciprocal. Iran has been supplying Russia with Shahed drones and ballistic missiles for its own war in Ukraine in exchange. This is a deep strategic interchange, and likely this partnership is not contingent if Russia gets emboldened by a European misstep. The only open question is how much further it goes. If anyone gets forced to act by pure economic necessity, it's not Europe. Japan sources roughly 94% of its crude oil from the Middle East, and somewhere between 80 to 93% of that oil transits through the Strait of Hormuz specifically, the highest dependency of any major economy, an order of magnitude more exposed than the EU, and China's claimed neutrality doesn't survive contact with its own arms sales. Reuters reported in July that Iran is receiving the first shipment under a deal for 300 to 400 Chinese-made manpads, explicitly to rebuild Iran's air defenses damaged in the war. However, trade only is not what the paper trail shows. Here's one way this gets much bigger, and it starts with Europe and not Washington. If European navies escorting an American offensive on Kharg Island draw Iran into a full retaliatory campaign against the Gulf states, Shahed drones aimed specifically at exhausting Patriot interceptor stockpiles across the GCC, that depletion doesn't stay contained to the Gulf. Cyprus's actual protection so far has come from active British and Greek interception, not geography. If that interceptor capacity gets drawn down supporting a wider Gulf campaign, Cyprus becomes measurably more exposed, not because luck runs out, but because the systems doing the actual work are stretched thinner. And there's a specific reason Suda and Akrotiri, not somewhere else, would be the target if this widens. If heavy fighting in the Gulf draws American, European, and Israeli assets to concentrate at the region's largest hub outside the immediate war zone, which Suda Bay already effectively is, Iran would have both the motive and, per Russia's already established intelligence support, plausibly the means to know exactly where that concentration sits. If there was a formal war status with all of NATO, this removes whatever diplomatic restraint currently holds. Two honest caveats belong in the same breath as this claim. Militaries generally disperse assets specifically to avoid this kind of concentrated vulnerability, and NATO's actual response to the Akrotiri strike so far has been more measured than a quote total war framing would predict. Rhetoric without an Article 5 invocation. This is informed speculation about incentives, not a prediction of what would happen if this potential escalation were to materialize. Further, and explicitly more speculative still, a scenario in which Israel moves against Turkey to push it out of NATO and toward Iran's side is not yet something to expect soon. Israel fighting two major adversaries at once isn't a credible near-term posture. If it happens at all, it's a matter of years and not months. That shouldn't rule out the plausibility of such a move. Iran retains ties with Turkey through a managed rivalry. Quote, and if Israel's own doctrine of preemptive strike comes to treat Turkey as a threat to its stated war interests, Israel could strike Turkey as deterrence, especially given Turkish rhetoric toward Israel over the past decade. What doesn't require nearly as much speculation is who gets forced to act by simple economic necessity. If the strait stays closed or contested long enough, Japan, at roughly 90% Hormuz dependent for its crude oil, has a far stronger incentive to intervene diplomatically or otherwise than any European state does. That's not a dramatic escalation claim, where given China, South Korea, Malaysia, Indonesia, and essentially the entire ASEAN trading bloc need Middle Eastern energy to function at well and to a substantial scale. That's just what the dependency numbers say it happens to whoever needs the oil the most.